my fellow historians, and welcome to another episode of Zay Historicizes. I hope you guys have had an amazing weekend. It is Sunday night, so of course I'm sat here once again before the week to film another episode of Zay Historicizes. This episode has been a long time coming. That's how I'm gonna preface it with, because this episode is inspired by the fact that this week I had the opportunity, the privilege to watch the PBS documentary, shout out to PBS, titled The Great Migration, A People on the Move, and that is another wonderful Henry Louis Gates Jr. documentary that focuses primarily on, of course, the Great Migration of Black Americans during the early to mid 20th century. And this episode of Zay Historicizes is going to be inspired by, of course, that documentary. It, to me, was just incredibly fascinating, and it is in 4 parts. And it's something that it is a documentary that I plan to watch for a while. It initially came out in February, but I figured that now was the time to do it because I wanted to go ahead and do my episode of the Great Migration. I'm going to be focusing so much on migration and immigration and just the general movement of people to the United States in the next several episodes, and I figured that this is a really, really good place to start. One thing that I wanted to point out is that and this is something that Devarian Baldwin, who is one of the historians in the documentary, states, which makes the Great Migration so interesting, is that typically, people view the United States of America as the land of freedom and opportunity. People have come to this country since the Gilded Age, really, in order to better themselves, finding a way to achieve the coveted American dream. And that is something that you have with this mass wave of immigration from Europeans in the Gilded Age and into the Progressive era. But you also see that exact same thing in the later half of the 20th century as it relates to a lot of immigrants who are coming here from Latin America, Asia, and Africa up until today. A lot of those immigrants are coming to a United States of America that has been shaped by the contributions of Black Americans. So a lot of the privileges that, let's say, I as an African immigrant get to have in the United States is thanks to the sacrifices and contributions of Black Americans. What makes the Great Migration so interesting and so unique is that it is not a movement to the United States, it is simply regionally based. What you have are a foundational group of Americans, Black Americans, who by the time the Great Migration starts had already been in this nation for several centuries, who are taking arguably the biggest leap in American history that a group of people take towards self-determination. And they're associating the American dream and their achieving of the American dream, not with coming to the United States of America, but with moving northward and westward, mostly from more rural places to more urban centers so that they can fully participate in American citizenship. And that is what makes the Great Migration incredibly unique. And when Devarian Baldwin pointed that out, I said, this is exactly what I'm talking about. And it also makes sense that the Great Migration is that amazing precursor to the civil rights movement, which would absolutely reshape the United States of America as we know it. So again, this episode is really a long time coming, and it is going to be just one part of several series. And just so that I can really put this into perspective, the Great Migration is typically in 2 parts. So you have the first wave and then you have the second wave. This video is going to focus on the first wave of the Great Migration, which starts at the tail end of World War I and lasts through the 1930s and stops at around 1940. However, piggybacking off of the documentary, I'm not just going to necessarily tell the story of the Great Migration. This video is going to focus very heavily on first-person resources. And the reason I'm doing so is because I really, really want to spotlight the way that the Great Migration played out in media, Black media and white media, while it was going on. I'm also going to be looking at letters from a lot of prospective migrants that were written to the Chicago Defender, because the Chicago Defender is such a pinnacle part, of course, of the role that media plays in the Great Migration. So this video is going to be very, very heavy as far as first-person resources go. If you've been seeing this channel for a while, you know that's one of my favorite things to do. But again, this video is going to spotlight the media. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to spotlight attitudes of the Great Migration by those who experienced that era as it was happening in real time. The first, most pressing, and most obvious impacts of the Great Migration, obviously, are just demographical changes. The Great Migration is something that changes the demographics of the United States. Before the Great Migration, around 90%, over 90% of America's Black population is centered in the South southeastern part of the United States, because obviously that is where the trade of slavery was. And by the time you get to the 1970s, when the Great Migration is largely over, just a little over half of Black Americans are still in the southeastern part. Black Americans essentially go from a very rural demographic to a very urban demographic. And to really further drive the impact of the demographic changes of the Great Migration, it is worth noting that before the Great Migration, there are 3 states: Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, that all have majoritively Black populations. So that is the only time in American history where you actually see a state have a majority Black population, which shows just how compacted the population, the Black population in the United States, was in the South in that era. And after the Great Migration, by the time you get into the 1940s, all of these states have white majorities. The first wave of the Great Migration takes 1.6 million Black Americans out of the rural American South. The total number for the Great Migration, both first and second wave, is going to be over 6 million Black Americans. So again, that is a very, very wonderful perspective into just how amazing and how profound the Great Migration is when it comes to just demographics. But the Great Migration is not actually really the very first migration that we see of Black Americans. In fact, we start to see those right after the antebellum period. Of course, in 1865, you have the abolition of slavery around the country. And with the abolition of slavery, you have a lot of the formerly enslaved people, and what they're going to be doing is they're going to be connecting with loved ones. I'm sorry if you can hear my cat meowing here, but they're going to be connecting with loved ones. So they do typically use media to connect with loved ones, like family, you know, obviously wives, husbands, mothers, fathers, children who have been sold. And so you do have a lot of movement that is happening in the South as far as reconnectivity is concerned. You also have the movement of a lot of rural African Americans to larger southern cities. These are places like Birmingham, Alabama, Jacksonville, Florida, Memphis, Tennessee, and Atlanta, Georgia. These are larger cities where there's just more economic opportunity. So it does make a lot of sense that the formerly enslaved are moving to those places to fully and of course settle themselves. And by the time you get into 1900, in the very later half of the very late part of the 1800s, you also have the movement of Black Americans to states or places in Oklahoma and, you know, just more up around the Texas area. In fact, several years ago when I was really researching Greenwood, which was the pinnacle Black district of Tulsa, that is Black Wall Street there in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it was actually named Greenwood because so many of the people who lived there were actually from Greenwood, Mississippi. So there you have these people who of course are settling in Oklahoma, but they're originally from Mississippi. So migration was already happening. So before you really get to the Great Migration, there is already a movement of Black Americans in and around the South. Following the abolition of slavery, what you go into is the Reconstruction period, when a lot of this movement is happening. And for some time, the Reconstruction era in the South is a very hopeful time for a lot of the formerly enslaved. Reconstruction lasts until around the late 1870s, but after that, you have the rise of, you know, really the lost cause, of course, rhetoric of the South, and that is the rise of white supremacy, where you have incidents like the Wilmington Massacre or the Wilmington Insurrection in North Carolina in 1898. So for a time, things do look hopeful, but in a lot of ways, those hopes are dashed, and you do have the settling of white supremacy in the South. And a big question that a lot of people have, and this is something that they bring up in the documentary, is why wasn't there already this upward migration even under those conditions? And one thing that the documentary addressed specifically were, of course, just very practical reasons. One, you have family ties. This is where your family lives. It doesn't make a lot of sense for you to just up and go north where there is a lot of uncertainty there. It also makes sense that a lot of people don't exactly have the means to travel and get around at that time. The formerly enslaved, there were no reparations. A lot of them are starting from scratch, and they are a very economically stagnant and desolate class of people. And then lastly, you also have weather. One of the most hilarious things was how there was a woman who was being recorded who was from Florida, and she talks about her first time experiencing a Chicago winter. And I thought it was just really, really funny because she's just like, nobody prepared me for these Chicago winters. And that's just tea. It's like, if you're from Jacksonville, Florida, you are not prepared for a Chicago or Detroit winter. So weather also plays a big part into the idea of just staying in the South. But the South is where Black people were. That is an economy and a land that they built from scratch and for free. So it does make a lot of sense that Black Americans for a time were essentially staying there. What really changes, however, is World War I. And one thing that I want to note for this video is that World War I is what is going to be driving both waves of the Great Migration. So the first wave of the Great Migration is off the back of World War I, and the second wave of the Great Migration, that also explodes off the backs of World War II. So usually when you have these wartime efforts and incentives, you do have the rise of the Great Migration. And what you really do have is a lot of these European migrants who are coming here and they're settling here, they're picking up arms again because Europe is once again in war and they're going back home to fight in these wars. It's also, of course, stopped this wave of immigration, albeit for a time being, from Europe. And because of that, a lot of the industries in a lot of these northern cities are openly courting work from Black Americans in the South. This very, very first article that I'm going to read appeared on the Chicago Whip, and this is dated July 25th of 1919. And this has a lot to do, of course, it is centered around the wartime shortage, which creates a need for Black labor. This is actually titled Negro Labor in Demand. With these foreigners gone, the only logical source from which the large industries can expect to recruit their depleted labor ranks will be the Southern colored man. This means that at least 5 million or over about 50% of the Negroes now tilling the fertile soil of Dixie for a mere pittance will migrate to the Northeast and Northwest, thus leaving the sunny South gaping in despair, in the farmer's vernacular, to root hog or die poor. So there we are seeing in the Chicago Whip, this is again the July 25th, 1919 issue, where they are tying that wartime shortage of European immigrants and European migrants to the need for Black labor, and looking from there to Black migrants in the South. So the next article that I'm going to be reading, this is titled Wanted in Trenton, and this appeared on the Washington Times October 23rd, 1916 issue. This specific story was actually titled South Unable to Put Stop to Negro Exodus. Laborers Get Past State Guards in Migration to North. And I'm going to read the section Wanted in Trenton. When we were nearly here, he declared, a man entered the train and approached me, giving his credentials as a company representative. I want 25 educated Negroes, men who can read and write for Trenton, New Jersey, he told me. He said that he wanted them there to take the place of baggage smashers with a transfer company. He declared that labor was a scarce article in Trenton, and so many foreigners had returned to Europe to fight in the war. About 100 of the men I brought with me went to Baltimore, others went farther north. Most of them went with a certain large Eastern Railroad, which has been clamoring for men for some time. I understand that other Eastern roads intend to adopt the same methods to get men. The labor agent declared that an average of $2 per head was paid by Eastern employers to agents bringing Negroes from the South. He described the difficulty of getting the men out of the South and the subterfuges employed. It is 6 months in jail in Florida if you are caught, he said. That 10,000 Negroes have been brought north from the state of Florida alone was the estimate of the Times informant, who declared that the labor market of the South was being sadly depleted by the exodus of Negroes. So again, that specific article, which appeared on Washington Times October 23rd, 1916 issue, is clearly showing you here that you have this decreased labor force for a lot of European immigrants, which it's saying specifically have returned to Europe to fight in the war. And because of that, they are essentially importing a lot of Black men from places like Florida to work in these jobs and these industries. So again, the World War I wartime economy and the lack of a lot of European workers is really a major driving and turning point in the northward movement of Black Americans in the United States. And it absolutely speaks to the very first wave of the Great Migration. With the World War I wartime economy, the seeds are essentially sown for, again, the beginning of the Great Migration and the upward movement of Black Americans from the rural South to the more urban North. And During this period, you do see two schools of thought that begin to appear around the perspective of the northward migration of Black Americans out of the South. Not so surprisingly, there are those who are for the northward migration and there are those that are against it. One of the best examples of an individual who really pushes for northward migration is Robert S. Abbott. And Robert S. Abbott is the founder and a publisher of the Chicago Defender. And the Chicago Defender plays a huge part in the Great Migration. I mean, I cannot in any way, shape, or form diminish just the importance that the Chicago Defender plays. And Robert S. Abbott is very, very, very clearly pushing for the migration of Black Americans out of the South, and specifically to places like Chicago, as Chicago is a hotbed. It is one of those cities that is greatly impacted by the Great Migration. And on the Chicago Defender, Robert S. Abbott is not only posting stories of help wanted, these are the organizations that are employing Black people up in the North. He's also really putting a biblical perspective here. There is the usage of Exodus, and he is taking images of what he calls, of course, the Exodus, the mass exodus of Black Americans out of the South. What he's doing is also very political because he knows, of course, like alluded to in those two articles that I read earlier, that this is going to decimate the Southern economy. During the documentary, one of the ladies mentions like voting by feet or politics by moving. And with the South depending so heavily on Black labor, it does make a lot of sense that with people like Abbott really pushing for Black Americans to get out of the South, there is that idea that he wants to negatively impact the Southern economy. What he's looking to is to negatively impact these systems and institutions that have historically stripped Black people of their rights and only empowered and made wealthy white people. So there is absolutely that very political part of what he's trying to do. The Chicago Defender is eventually going to be the biggest Black paper in the country. It's soon going to have a circulation of over 500,000, which is incredibly significant. And by the time that you're getting into the late 1910s, you're really seeing how significant the role that Black media is playing in pushing for the migration. Black people all over the country are reading the media, and the Chicago Defender is the definition of it is the Black newspaper. And Pullman porters, which is a very interesting point that I discovered in my research and through the documentary, Pullman porters, who are these men that work these trains, they're doing a really, really good job at getting the word out there. In fact, these are men who are carrying the Chicago Defender with them. They are spreading the word around. They are making sure that they're going to these stations and seeing prospective migrants, Black people who are out of work or looking for work, and they're saying, read the Chicago Defender. Here's what Mr. Abbott is saying. Abbott is considered a race man, and a race man is just a man who is by and for the people. And he is somebody who is 100% pushing for the northward migration of Black Americans out of the South. For this next part of the video, what I wanted to read were letters to the Chicago Defender. And these letters were actually compiled by Emmett Johnson. And one of the things that I really wanted to spotlight in this video was, of course, the reason that I had been reading so many first-person sources was because I really wanted to put you guys in the minds of those who experienced the Great Migration in real time as they were doing it. And one of the most important ways to do that is actually sort of giving voice in a way to the name's history is forgotten, because when Emmett Johnson actually put this compilation together of all these letters to the Chicago Defender, he actually took away personal information. So he does not post names or things like that. But you do see the cities here. But I wanted to go ahead and read some of them because it 100% puts you into the mind of people who were experiencing the Great Migration in real time. So this first letter I'm going to read, this is from Dallas, Texas, and it was April 23rd of 1917. Having been informed through the Chicago Defender paper that I can secure information from you, I am a constant reader of the Defender and am contemplating on leaving here for some point north. Having your city in view, I thought the inquirer of you about conditions for work, housing, wages, and everything necessary. I'm now employed as a laborer in a structural shop, have worked for the firm 5 years. I stored cars for Armor Parking Company 3 years. I also claims to know something about candy making. Am handy at almost anything for an honest living. I'm 31 years old, have a very industrious wife, no children. If chances are available for work of any kind, let me know. Any information you can give me will be highly appreciated. So again, that is a letter that was sent to the Chicago Defender. I did want to go ahead and read this next one here. I saw an advertisement in the Chicago Ledger where you would send tickets to anyone desiring to come up there. I'm a married man with a wife only, and I'm 38 years of age, and both of us have so far splendid health and would like very much to come out there provided we could get good employment regarding the advertisement. And this is from Savannah, Georgia, April 24th of 1917. Now this next letter that I'm going to read comes from a woman, and this is dated April 25th, 1917, and it is pretty lengthy, but I did want to go ahead and read it because I have a follow-up read that I want to read after this. So, sir, I was reading in the paper about the colored race, and while reading it, I seen in it where cars would be here for the 15th of May, which is 1 month from today. Will you be so kind as to let me know where they are coming to, and I'll be glad to know because I'm a poor woman and have a husband and 5 children living and 3 dead, 1 single and 2 twin girls 6 months old today, and my husband can hardly make bread for them in Mobile. This is my native home, but it is not fit to live in, just as the Chicago Defender says the truth, and my husband only gets $150 a day and pays $750 a month for house rent and can hardly feed me and himself and children. I'm the mother of 8 children, 25 years old, and I want to get out of this dog hold because I don't know what I am raising them up for in this place. And I want to get to Chicago where I know they will be raised, and my husband crazy to get there because he know he can get more to raise his children. And will you please let me know where the cars is going to stop so that he can come where he can take care of me and my children. He get there a while and then he can send for me. I heard they wasn't coming here, so I sent to find out, and he can go and meet them at the place they are going and go from there to Chicago. No more at present. Hoping to hear from you soon, from you needed and worried friend. So I wanted to go ahead and read that because this is a woman who's writing, and I wanted to point out specifically that she's saying that her husband is going to go there first, settle a little bit, get work, and then come back for her and her children. What I'm going to be reading now is titled Northern Cities Having Trouble Handling Negroes from the South. And this has appeared on the Birmingham Age Herald on their issue dated May 11th of 1917. And this is a mainstream white paper. They have this section titled North Land of Promise. So the glorious opportunities of the North have been spread by ingenious men through every state in the South. $4 a day for common labor is the story that gets attention. No such wages were ever heard of in the South. Accepting the glowing story, men and women are hurrying to the land where such opportunities are waiting. Uninformed of other conditions, social, economic, or climactic, they smilingly join the throng that seeks the promised land. The movement last summer and winter was confined almost wholly to men. They were distributed through cities from St. Louis to Buffalo. Now the men have sent for their wives and children. A Sunday train from Cincinnati to Cleveland brought 1 car loaded with women and children to join their menfolks in Cleveland, Ashtabula, and Buffalo. The party was from Biloxi, Mississippi. They shivered in the raw wind that blew from the lake as they waited at the station. So I'm going to stop reading there. However, what you are seeing is this pattern of migration that I really noticed with the Great Migration. This pattern of migration designates that a lot of men are actually going to these northern cities first. They're getting work there, they're settling down, and then they're sending for their wives and children. And that letter from that woman is essentially talking about that same pattern where she believes that her husband will go there first, and once he settled down, he will send for her and all of their children. Robert S. Abbott isn't, however, the only black man with a paper and a huge platform. We do see other people like Winfield Young, and Winfield Young represents the opposing view. Winfield Young is he's the writer on the Norfolk Journal and Guide, and what Winfield Young actually believes is that Black Americans should remain in the South and be very cooperative, or try to cooperate with white Southerners in order to better their position here. One thing that I want to bring to light with the way Winfield Young feels is that it actually mirrors Booker T. Washington and how Booker T. Washington viewed, or would have viewed, the Great Migration. It is worth noting that Booker T. Washington passed away in 1915. So by 1917, where, you know, the war is coming to an end and you have this mass exodus beginning, Booker T. Washington he's passed away by this point. However, Winfield Young is most definitely carrying the rhetoric of Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington was somebody who did not really believe in a Great Migration. Booker T. Washington wanted Black Americans to, again, stay in the South, cooperate with whites there to help improve their conditions in the South. In my video for education, I mentioned how Booker T. Washington inhabited this separate school of thought from, as far as Black education was concerned, from W.B. Du Bois. And while W.B. Du Bois was pushing for going to school and getting this like white collar education, getting these white collar jobs for Black Americans, Booker T. Washington was actually pushing more so for Black Americans to learn trades and things like that. And to really put that into perspective, I want us to remember, of course, that Booker T. Washington was he was a Southern man, and he was looking at the more rural Southern economy. So a lot of Booker T. Washington's views, or even Winfield Young's view, I don't necessarily want to sit here and say that it is an inferior or wrong in any way to what Robert Abbott is doing. There is a logic to the way that they are approaching things. And I'm going to go ahead and read an article here. And this is actually from the Norfolk Journal and Guide. And this is titled "Our Attitude on the Migration Movement." And it appeared on the Journal and Guide's issue, April 14th, 1917. So this one here is, I'm just going to read, of course, like I always do, a tidbit of that article. But what Winfield Young states here is: "The Independent shares with a number of our exchanges, North and South, the belief that the Negroes who are concerned in the Exodus are fleeing from oppression in the South. We do not entertain that belief. We do not deny that there has been and will continue to be oppression in the South as long as the race problem is a human problem. But our observation is that the people who are most affected by the oppression are not leaving the South. It is our opinion that the Exodus was induced by an abnormal demand for unskilled labor at the North due to the exigencies of the European war. Had it not been for the war, we would never have heard of the Exodus. Southern oppression to the contrary notwithstanding." This is a very, very interesting piece that I wanted to share with you guys, because Winfield Young has a point here. The people who are most impacted by this, the poorest Black Americans, aren't necessarily the ones who are leaving. There is a bit of a class basis that is tied to the Great Migration, and there is a bit of a privilege there, because there are people who in a lot of ways can't actually afford to leave. And what Winfield Young is really saying here is he does mention that the only reason that this migration even starts is because of the shortage of labor from European migrants who are going back to Europe to fight in the war. It is a bit of an argument. Obviously, I do believe that there likely would have still been a migration, just tied obviously to the economic and social political stagnation of Blackness that was instituted by Southern forces in that era. But in a lot of ways, Winfield Young is actually, he's very clear in the way that he views the motives behind the Great Migration, and how he doesn't necessarily feel that they're 100% tied to oppression, as it is mostly this labor market that is just opened, which is, again, 100% factual. So these schools of thoughts, as they relate to the Great Migration, are of course playing out in real time. And there are a lot of conversations that are being had by Black people around the country in regard to the Great Migration and what this mass exodus actually means, why it's happening, but ultimately what it means for Black people. One thing that I wanted to do in this video was also spotlight the way that a lot of white Southerners felt about the Great Migration and their beliefs of exactly why the Great Migration Migration was happening. And the reason that I wanted to do that is because we do see that although white media is starting to speak up in the South about the Great Migration and the mass exodus of the Negroes, of course, as it would have been in those days, they aren't actually outlining the idea of this oppressive white supremacy that exists in the South for very obvious reasons. They're tying it to other things, namely the economy and even the boll weevil, which is this insect that is essentially decimated southern crops. So I wanted to go ahead and read a specific article. This is titled Negroes Consider Food Situation, and this is from The State, which is a South Carolina. It's based out of Columbia, South Carolina, dated June 2nd of 1917. Negroes Consider Food Situation. State Preparedness Commission meets in Lawrence. Talks of migration. Encouraging reports received from the Piedmont of the state. So here you're seeing that this Southern paper of the state is stating that Negroes are looking at the food situation. So there is a bit of a famine that is actually occurring in the South at this time due to the boll weevil, I believe. I had never even heard of this insect before I watched the documentary, but this is what they are 100% tying it to. There is, of course, another article that I wanted to read as well, which is also going to spotlight the white perception of why Black people are living. And this section is titled Bishop Chappelle Talks of Exodus. And this is The State, so Columbia, South Carolina again, but this is published 5 years later. This is December 5th of 1922. One thing that I want to point out is that a lot of white media in the South at this time, they are actually, whenever they are spotlighting Black voices on the Great Migration, they are typically spotlighting Black voices that are anti the Great Migration for very, very obvious reasons. So this is titled Bishop Chappelle, who is a Black man, Talks of Exodus. Head of African Methodist gives opinion, is opposed to move, shocker. Says lenient treatment on party of white landlords may check migration. So I'm gonna go ahead and read the section which is titled Flocks to Cities. Most of the Negroes who have left the state have gone to New York and Chicago. In the counties from which the migration have been heaviest are Abbeville, Greenwood, and McCormick. In some sections where the boll weevil has been particularly destructive, the treatment given the tenants has been harsh. So here you are seeing that once again they are tying this northward migration to, again, this food situation, this famine that is coming out of the boll weevil, which has decimated southern crops. But they also are saying that white landlords may check migration by being a little more lenient on their tenants. It is very interesting that this Southern paper did, of course, spotlight that, but again, they are spotlighting this bishop here, Bishop Chappelle, who is a Black man, and in big bold letters, they're saying he is against the Great Migration. And again, once it comes to the perception of the Great Migration, a lot of white papers in the South, because of course they're trying to curb the migration for very obvious reasons, economic reasons, they are typically given voice in spotlighting Black people who are against the migration. So that is very important to note here. So taking into the perspective around a lot of the white delusions that are tied to why Black Americans are leaving, as it ties to the boll weevil and a lot of other factors, essentially addressing everything than what exactly needs to be addressed, I did want to go ahead and read this next article, and this is titled The Charge, T. Craven's Views on Negro Migration and What It Means. And T. Craven's, I didn't really look too much into him, but he does have another section on this paper where he's fully blaming the mass migration of Black Americans to the boll weevil. And he is a white man, and he's essentially saying this is why they are leaving. And this specific article actually appears on the Denver Star, February 3rd of 1917. So again, this is a Black paper, the Denver Star, that is looking at his opinion of why Black people are leaving. And here they are saying, well, here's the charge, here's the tea. So in another column of this paper will appear a communication to the Constitution by T. Cravens under the caption, Boll Weevil and the Negro Emigration, Not So Bad as they at first seemed. He attributes the migration of the Negro very largely to the boll weevil, causing the white farmer who has been supplying the Negro in the past to withdraw his support and declare that he would be unable to supply him another year, and that he would have to supply himself. Perhaps this did have something to do with it, but it isn't the real cause in our opinion. The real cause is greater and deeper than this. The boll weevil and the support of the white farmer were only an incident. The real cause is mistreatment and the failure to secure the liberty which the Negro, in common with all other men, longs for. The Negro is an American to the manner born. He has imbued the American spirit, having lived, moved, and had his being in this country for nearly 300 years. Our white neighbors either do not know the cause or won't acknowledge it. Man cannot live by bread alone. You might give the Negro all the material wealth in the world, and yet he would not be satisfied any more than a white man whose civil and political rights were abridged. There is never a Negro on the jury. He never holds a place of honor or trust, not even as much as a coroner or bailiff. Our white neighbors may as well understand it once for all that nothing in the world will satisfy the Negro and stop this mighty tide of migration but equal and exact justice. The slogan is liberty, and when our white neighbors, as does Mr. Cravens, attribute the Negro migration to such trivial things as boll weevil and lack of support by white farmers, they deceive themselves. The Negro wants to go where he can get liberty, where he can get better schools, better wages, better school facilities, better political opportunities, and better protection of life. That is the main reason the Negro is going north. I always love the way that black papers approach things because it's always like so woke, but I really love the way that he takes T. Craven's assumption of the boll weevil and lack of support from white farmers, and he's saying, you're not acknowledging the truth because it's something that makes you very uncomfortable. And it is worth noting that at this time, you have the term race agitator. And it's something that gets thrown a lot on Ida B. Wells, as she's, of course, this investigative journalist who is bringing to the forefront of American minds like lynch law in the South, where a lot of white Southerners are very uncomfortable when it comes to discussing lynchings. They're not uncomfortable doing it, they're just uncomfortable talking about it. And it is one of those things where you see a lot of people who may perpetuate racism usually don't like talking about it because it makes them very uncomfortable. And here you're seeing the Denver Star where they're straight up saying, you're missing the point. This isn't about just the boll weevil. This isn't just about lack of support. This is about the fact that the Black Americans in the South are a completely unprotected class of people who have no rights. They have no rights to property. They can't serve on juries. They can't vote. They can't fully ingratiate themselves in the citizenship that actually has been promised to them by law. That is the reason that black people are really moving north. So I most definitely wanted to spotlight the charge here because it is so beautifully written out plainly back in 1917 of exactly why a lot of black people are choosing to leave the South. There you have it. You have these causes of exactly why people are leaving the South en masse. And again, the media is very, very heavily covering these things. But what are those reactions? How does the South how do white institutions specifically approach the mass migration? And what are their opinions on the mass migration of Black Americans out of the state? So I'm going to go ahead and read one of the articles that I had read just the titles of earlier. It is the Bishop Chappelle Talks of Exodus. And this is, again, the States from Columbia, South Carolina, dated December 5th of 1922. But I'm going to go ahead and read just the first two paragraphs here. Citizens of South Carolina who keep even indifferently in touch with what is happening within the confines of the Commonwealth, persons who are at all not aware of what is taking place know full well that many Negroes are leaving the states. Scenes around small railroad stations, glimpses into the coaches on trains reserved for Negroes, and deserted cabins through the country districts all carry their message. A message so clear and so direct that even the wayfaring man may read. To know that Negroes are leaving and to attempt to arrive at some definite figure as to the number that have already departed are, however, two very different matters. Any man who travels much over the state will inform the inquirer that he sees many signs of this migration, the flight of a race before the ravages of a tiny insect, but definite figures are difficult to procure. So again, here you have this white South Carolina paper where, again, they're talking about the insect, the boll weevil, but they are very clearly stating here, this is 1922, December of 1922, that black people are leaving. We're all seeing it. We all notice it. You might not be into politics. You might not even, you're living in the state and you see that black people are leaving this state. And there are a lot of reactions that a lot of white papers are taking specifically to the upheaval of black people. There are a lot of papers that I was able to see where, you know, there are a lot of Southern fears that they're bringing forefront to the fear of black people leaving. There was this really hilarious one from the state about how even the good Negroes have left the state. Gee, I don't know why that would be the case. South Carolina is, of course, hit so hard by the Great Migration, and those fears are incredibly heightened for many, many reasons. People are actually starting to appeal to the governors. They're appealing to mayors to do something to quell the mass migration of Black Americans out of South Carolina. I'm going to go ahead and read this other section that was from the book Entangled in White Supremacy. And this one starts with South Carolina's post-war governor, Robert A. Cooper, confessed that to a considerable extent, the economic prosperity of the South depends upon Negro labor. Moreover, the Georgia Bankers Association considered the migration more costly than General Sherman on his march to the sea. African Americans, Black Americans made up such a huge force of labor in the South, and it is absolutely starting to scare people that Black Americans are even thinking of leaving the state. So this is something that white Southerners are absolutely noticing, and something that they're also going to start to push back against. I'm going to go ahead and read another section off of Entangled in White Supremacy, so by Janet Hudson. So this states that migration opponents not only looked for state assistance in restraining Black laborers, but they also turned to key businesses for help. The Southern Railway, sympathetic with landowners, reported inability to retain sufficient agricultural labor, adopted a company policy against transporting African Americans who were migrating north. The railroad company pledged to discourage the Negro exodus from the South in every legitimate manner. Southern Railway's management ordered its employees to discontinue the company's long-standing practice of using extra space in baggage cars to carry Black passengers, in exchange for committing the railway to the promotion of a campaign to induce the Negro to remain in the South. Southern Railway asked that bankers and other business owners support its efforts by employing surplus Black labor in their communities. So there are a lot of ways that they are trying to mitigate this movement, and it does start with going after railway companies, of course, because this is the 1910s and 1920s. So that is still the most popular form of at least really, you know, far transportation. And it is worth noting here that as you have the Great Migration progress, there are certain things where they are actually increasing the wages of farm labor for sharecroppers. And they are trying to throw in, you know, these sort of things here where they're saying, okay, because we don't want to lose this absolutely massive and important force of Black labor, we are going to throw in a couple of what hopefully you guys consider wins, just so that you guys aren't leaving. So again, with that, you know, of course, that segment that I just read, you are seeing the ways that a lot of white Southerners are pushing to actually physically refrain Black people from leaving the South and not to decimate the Southern economy. It is also worth noting that white Southerners are also actually fairly aware of the Defender. So the Chicago Defender, which is now the biggest and most popular Black newspaper in the entire country, is something that they actually do push to attack. So you have the Arkansas Democrat in 1917 run this story titled "The Defender Banned," and this is in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. February 24th, 18 leaders of the colored community here, including 2 ministers, 2 school principals, and professional men, have been named defendants in a suit filed by city officials seeking an injunction to prohibit circulation in the county of a Chicago newspaper on the ground that the paper tended to incite the colored people. A temporary restraining order was obtained. So when I mentioned earlier that Robert Abbott is actively pushing stories of this, you know, mass exodus, he's really pushing to make sure that Black people are literally getting out of the South for purposes of economically stagnating the southern states. White newspapers are starting to be aware of that, and white media is starting to be aware of that. So because of that, the Chicago Defender does gain this reputation as being the insider for colored people or Black people to leave the South. So we do see that the pallbearers, who are of course going ahead and passing around the Chicago Defender are also people who are being impacted by this. They are making sure that the word is getting out there and people are noticing. Of course, pallbearers also work in trains for these like luxury trains, and they're around a lot of very, very well-to-do white Southerners. So it would be in the best interest of many of these people to make sure that the Chicago Defender literally stays in Chicago. But of course that isn't the case. And Robert S. Abbott is, he has these men on the ground spreading the word. And regardless of whatever is going to happen, regardless of these reactions, the word is getting out there and people are leaving the South in droves. Regardless of whatever is happening, the population of Black Americans leaving is only increasing, and it only increases greatly throughout the 1920s. So a lot of these northern cities have Black populations that are absolutely booming by the time you get into the 1930s and the 1940s. I'm going to just post a graphic here of the difference in Black populations in 1910 and 1940 in a lot of these major cities. And you have cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York, and you have these Black districts that are being founded there. You have Black Bottom in Detroit, you have the Hill District in Pittsburgh, you have Bronzeville in Chicago, and you have 7th Ward in Philadelphia. So a lot of Black people are coming there and they're settling in these places in town where Black residents are. It is also worth noting that northern cities have very, very poignant segregation as well. And what you really have is the segregation of these cities where the city officials are essentially saying like, this is going to be the Black part of the city. This is where the Black people are going to stay here. So Bronzeville in the south side of Chicago, or, Los Angeles with South Central LA, those are essentially like census designated areas for Black people. And these places, not only do they experience this mass migration, they also do become crowded very, very quickly. And it is worth noting that after the war and you have the return of a lot of the European migrants, there is a lot of tension that is going to be booming. There's a lot of tension that is quickly growing and in regards to race relations in these cities. In 1917, you have the East St. Louis race riots. And that is a very, very violent period in St. Louis that lasts several days where people are going around just attacking. They are full-blown attacking East St. Louis where the Black residents are staying. So with these people who are coming back from war, you have a lot of these unionized men. They are coming back to see that Black Americans have essentially taken their jobs. Black Americans are now working a lot of those jobs. And this happens with a lot of violence, unrest. The post-World War I period in American history is the most violently racial time in American history, bar none. You have a lot of race riots and massacres that occur at that time. This is the era of Elaine, it's the era of East St. Louis, Chicago, Tulsa, Rosewood, you name it. That is all happening with the upward mobility, and it's really on the backs of the Great Migration. So as you have Black Americans settling in those cities, and you have people who are coming back, returning from the war, these unionized, these working men, it absolutely boils over with a lot of racial tensions. But this does not actually curb the Great Migration. Thousands of Black Americans are still moving northward to settle in these cities. There's a rebuilding that is being done. There are communities that are being formed. And regardless of whatever is going on with these cities, they are still making time to settle their communities. They're making time to look out for each other. And what you have is this growing perception of the new Negro. So the idea of the new Negro really comes off of not only the northward migration to these major cities, but also the really violent period following World War I, such as incidents like the St. Louis race riots, and of course the Chicago riots in particular. In 1919, when you have a Black beachgoer who is essentially murdered by a white mob by, I guess, going into the white side of the beach in Chicago, Black people in Chicago immediately come together and they begin protesting exactly what happened in a way that would not have happened in the South. They are calling for police to hold these people accountable for what they're doing. And what you have is this onslaught where you have a lot of white Chicagoans who are running into Bronzeville, the Black side of town, to attack and destroy things. And what makes the Chicago race riots very different is that you have these black men who have fought in World War I who are full-blown picking up arms themselves. They're going and standing on the rooftops. They're standing in alley corners, and they are full-blown defending Bronzeville. They're defending the south side of Chicago where the black people live, and they are shooting at rioters if they need to. And there are images of a lot of these confrontations, but what you see here is that they aren't just standing idly while these things are happening, because of course there is that awareness with black people at this time that police officers obviously aren't really going to do anything. What they're saying, what you're really seeing here is the idea that they are full-blown stating that we are going to be the defenders of our own communities, and we aren't just going to let people get away with this violence. So what I wanted to read here is a quick article on the new Negro, and this appeared on the Chicago Defender issue dated August 3rd of 1919. So this is right after the race riots, and this is actually titled Race Riots and Their Remedy. So I'm going to read the section for the new Negro, and it states here, the spirit of the Negro who went across the seas, who was in action, and who went over the top is by no means the spirit of the Negro before the war. He is altogether a new man, with new ideas, new hopes, new aspirations, and new desires. He will not quietly submit to former conditions without a vigorous protest, and we should not ask him to do so. It is a new Negro that we have with us now, and may we not hope also that we have a new white man? The war has revolutionized the entire world. It has changed our mode of thinking and our mode of action. So here you actually have, his name is W.S. Scarborough, who is the president of Wilberforce University. I'm going to do a story on Wilberforce one day, because that's a very separate, interesting history there. But what he's harping on is the idea of the new Negro, and that is the fact that these people have gone and fought a war overseas to defend this country, and they're not coming back to deal with a lot of the same things that their fathers or grandfathers dealt with. And in years ago on this channel, I'm pretty sure it was when I first started this channel, it was maybe in like 2021, I mentioned that there was the idea of the double V victory, which was pushed by a lot of intellectuals like W.B. Du Bois at this time. And the WV victory really meant that they could get a victory abroad, which is of course fighting for the United States, but also come back and win a victory domestically at home. So the idea that you're fighting for freedom and justice internationally, but when you come back to the United States, you are also demanding that for yourself. You're really, really going to see this absolutely blow up with the civil rights movement, which is more so a result of the second wave of the Great Migration. So we're not necessarily getting into like that post-World War II social political climate in this video, but you are seeing the beginnings of that. The idea that we're fighting internationally and we're not going to come back to that same treatment. So the Chicago race riots, where you do have black men take up arms in full-blown fight back up to including injuring and even killing some of these rioters, is where you see that change, where they're saying that we are going to be our own defenders and we are absolutely not taking this treatment. And the movement up north most definitely emboldens many black men, as well as of course fighting in World War I to approach this. So this is the idea of the new Negro, and of course the idea that the new Negro fights back. One thing that I also wanted to mention, just looking through Emmett Johnson's and all the letters he compiled for these people who had sent these letters to the Chicago Defender, is the idea that a lot of black Americans were leaving the South with the idea that white people in the North were going to be these sort of like racially blind people, is not something that I really want to push with this specific video, mainly because of the fact that I think a lot of people have approached the Great Migration from the idea that black Americans were leaving the South to escape racism, which just isn't true. And one of the best ways I can really put that is just looking through all of the letters that Emmett Johnson actually compiles. There is barely any mention of white people or race entirely. The only time they're really referring to is of course with themselves, and of course inquiring with the Chicago Defender or maybe even other black people about how to get up north, how to safely travel there and traverse that trip in a lot of ways. So the idea that they were going to be escaping racism doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. It's also worth noting that a lot of cities like Chicago and St. Louis, these are these major grounds of the Great Migration, are wrought with a lot of racial violence in the late 1910s. And you're seeing specifically that black media is covering these things, yet they are still going there. So a lot of black people are not writing these letters with this idea that they're escaping racism. Their approach to the Great Migration in real time is not about escaping and getting away from racism. That's just the reality that they're going to have to deal with wherever they are in this country in that era, unfortunately. But they are moving mainly for economic reasons. You see these letters and they're inquiring about jobs. They're inquiring about settling there so they can come back and pick up their wives and children. That is really that is the general gist around the minds of people who are going up towards the North. It is not about escaping racism. And I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions sometimes that we have about Black Americans during the Great Migration. There is an awareness that they are likely going to encounter racism, which is very clear with residential segregation in a lot of the cities that they're going to. They have to settle in the Hill District, they have to settle in Bronzeville because they really can't go and settle anywhere else. Yet they are still going there for purposes of bettering themselves and, of course, that social political upward mobility that they want to partake in. So by the time you get into the 1930s, you have the Great Migration. And the Great Migration is very significant because that is where the Great Migration starts to really taper off. And it's not going to, the second wave is not going to hit really strongly until you get into the post-World War II period. And quick side note, the second wave of the Great Migration is much larger than the first wave. And I was just covering the first wave for this video. But again, by the 1930s, that does sort of taper down and the Great Migration slows down, only because unemployment in the Great Depression hits the Black community harder than it hits anybody else. And at one point in the 1930s, about half of Black people are out of work. Somebody put it in the documentary as the last to be hired and first to be fired. And actually, once you get into World War II, before you even get to World War II, which is what I'm going to get into in the next video, you have a huge labor win under the Roosevelt administration, thanks to the way that Black people in the North are starting to unionize. And of course, that idea of that growing Black, the idea of the growing Black vote, the idea of this more socially, politically aware and mobile and certainly influential Black population as it is happening. And that is actually thanks to the first wave of the Great Migration. But again, with this video, what I was really just trying to do was, shed light on the Great Migration. So I didn't, of course, just want to do it just documentary style, but this video was very, very heavy with a lot of reading, and I understand that, and a lot of first-person sources. But what I really wanted to do was get again into the mind of migrants. I want to get into the mind of the writers, the pushers, the publishers, the people who were observing the migration and living through it in real time. So again, that is just the very first section of the Great Migration. This was just looking at the Great Migration as it occurred in the very first wave through up until about the 1930s till about 1940. So I really hope that you enjoyed that video. I am going to be linking a lot of what I read down, as I always do, just in case you guys want to read a lot of those. And I actually paid for like a new newspaper subscription just so that I could get better access to the archives that I want, so that I can actively look up the newspapers that I want to screenshot and read for these videos. But again, that was just a video about the way that the media specifically approached in real time the Great Migration, the first wave of the Great Migration, as it began happening in the 1910s and up until the end of the first wave of the Great Migration in and around the beginning of United States involvement in World War II. Child, there are so many parts of this video. I literally decided to split this into like a 3-part series only because I didn't want a super, super long video. But I haven't even edited yet, and I know this is going to be an incredibly long video, which is so funny to me. But at the exact same time, I really hope that you guys enjoyed that video. Again, that was just the first wave of the Great Migration. See you next for part 2. Thanks so much, as always, for your support. Thank you so much for watching. I do see that this channel is growing, and I really love to see that. But so yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope hope you guys all had a wonderful weekend, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful week. We should be halfway through by the time I post this video. But again, thanks so much for watching, and you guys enjoy your day.